Hello and welcome back to the Slashcast podcast. I'm here with Eric and just wanted to do a quick intro and reminder to like, share, subscribe. We probably haven't covered this in as explicit a format as we should, but the reason this is called Slashcast is because Eric and I have talked about work-life balance, and we have both kind of agreed that that is a bit of a wayward concept, but that if we look at it as work/life/balance, those overlaps and the slashes are where the interesting stuff is happening. So we are going more on the work side of the equation today, and we are going to be discussing the Working Backwards Toolkit. Eric, do you have that in front of you? There it is, the Working Backwards Toolkit. So a quick overarching question is, we've done issues on social and political matters and other life matters, but we're really digging into work this time. So how is this going to be of interest to a general audience?
Yeah, well, I think that we're going to talk a lot about the scientific method, as it turns out, in talking about innovation today. And one of the nice things about this process is that you can apply it anywhere. It doesn't only have to be about innovation and about, enterprise stuff. It can just be about how you become a better parent or a better spouse or a better anything, right? Because it's essentially applying the scientific method to discover truths. And those truths can be about work, but they don't have to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you have any project and you have an idea, you have a product idea, but any kind of other, even creative projects, thinking about how to iterate and experiment and iterate and experiment and take in information and data and apply those to your decision making, I think is a pretty fundamental skill that you can work on. So I encourage those who might be put off by what seems like product development and innovation in a more corporate setting to tune in, see if there's something that you can get out of it. But I think this will actually be really good for those who are specifically around in areas around product development, innovation, corporate environments, startups. This is really key fundamental stuff that can help with your work there. So let's start with what is working backwards. So you and I both came out of Amazon, and the working backwards concept is pretty fundamental there. In that context, it means working backwards from the customer. Amazon bills itself as the most customer-centric company in the world, and that's in all of its leadership principles, mechanisms, etc. And some of the ways that this is implemented include the press release FAQ process, where if you have a product idea, you imagine what the customer would release as a press release showing the value, and have questions and answers around that. 6-pagers, which is for a business idea that you might have. That's how AWS was actually created by Andy Jassy, was as a 6-page document. We're not going to go into all of the Amazon mechanisms in depth today, but one other kind of point I wanted to make is there's the apocryphal statement from Henry Ford. If I ask my customers what they want, they would say a better horse. And there's a reason why this doesn't violate that principle. And I have my ideas, but maybe I'll ask you for yours as well. So this is not just surveying customers about what they want. It's really about observing customers in different ways in their actual environment, and you can use surveys as part of that, but identifying pain points and then experimenting on solutions that might address those pain points, collecting data, and narrowing down product market fit. Do you have anything to add to that part?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think I would distinguish between Amazon working backwards and so when I was first working at AWS with working backwards, one of the things, because I came from a professional services part, or we both came from a professional services part of that business. And the role of professional services is to help customers to adopt, whether it's the Amazon cloud platform or whether it's Working Backwards, is to help them adopt. And one of the things I felt early on was that Amazon Working Backwards, sort of as a philosophy, it worked well inside Amazon. And because Amazon was Amazon, it actually worked well to drive innovation. But if you tried to help another company, a customer, apply Working Backwards to their own problems, it basically would always fail. Like, we really couldn't export this best practice outside of Amazon without exporting everything else about Amazon, which is not realistic for any other company. And so the toolkit was really built as a response to that. It starts from the question of, how does an external company that doesn't have Jeff Bezos, that doesn't have the leadership principles, that doesn't use mechanisms, that, it is not Amazon, how does that company adopt and apply this idea of working backwards so that they get a better hit rate on their innovation? Because companies around the world are spending trillions of dollars, and most of that is going to waste, right? Because, according to Harvard Business Review, 85% of new products will actually fail in the marketplace. So the toolkit is there to say, it's more than just philosophy. It's a set of practices, a practical set of practices that anybody in any firm can adopt, whether they're innovating B2C or whether they're innovating B2B or government to citizen, or even if they're just innovating for inside stakeholders. These are a set of practices that you can use to give you the same results as Amazon in its use of working backwards. So the toolkit, I think about the toolkit quite differently from what we would say Amazon working backwards. Although some of the tools are there. So you mentioned the PRFAQ or the press release frequently asked questions. Those tools both exist in both realms, but not all of them do.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. And we're definitely going to dig much deeper into those areas. But the kind of the fundamental shared practices are around the scientific method. So you come up with a hypothesis, right? Whether it's from empirical observation or whatever. So you have observation, hypothesis, experimentation, iteration, and then you have MVP, minimum viable product, to test product market fit. And I know we've discussed this a lot, and this is a particular sticking point for you. So I will point out for you that minimum viable product is not just the least shitty thing you can throw out there. It serves a specific purpose, which is to test product market fit. So what is the easiest, quickest way to test whether this idea has any actual traction in the marketplace? And I covered for you in some of the entrepreneurship, and we covered this at Singapore Management University, where you can talk about concierge services, where you kind of fake it till you make it. Instagram went out and they literally, before they were called Instagram, they asked people, hey, can I see your pictures and prettify it and show it to you? Is that something you would like? And so they didn't have an actual product, but they had the idea and they had a way to test it. And the testability is really the key idea around the MVP.
Yeah, spot on. I think the big mistake is if I just say MVP, most audience members are going to describe it as what you said is like the least shitty product that you can get out fast to market, right? And so there's this idea that that's what MVP is. And the problem is that's a really, really, really dangerous product development strategy, because what you're basically saying is, I'm going to launch to my customer a shitty product, a minimum, what's minimally viable, that's what I'm going to give to my customer, which is not going to give you a particularly good brand, and it's not going to sell product, right? And so,
well, it's also not going to answer the question that you want to answer.
Yeah, or solve the pain that you want to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just don't use that acronym anymore. When I talk about the two different things, there's a set of experiments, and I don't need to give them a special name, so I don't give it an acronym. It's just an experiment. And then there's a minimum lovable product, and that's the thing you launch. You don't launch a product to market until your customer is going to be delighted. They're going to love that experience. So we don't launch real products until they hit that bar. And so otherwise, What Eric Ries and Lean Startup meant was that an MVP is just a form of experiment, and that experiment could have physical shape like a prototype, but it doesn't have to. Like you said in Instagram, there was no product; there was just customer discovery interviews and learning, and that was the MVP. So, anyways, I don't use MVP anymore because it's so confusing. And
Yeah, you use the much clearer idea of minimum lovable product. So
that's clear. That's correct. That's clear.
By the way, just as an aside, I hate that the word delight has just become so integral to all these discussions. It makes me feel queasy. It's just a personal thing. Okay, so let's kind of dig deeper into what the actual working backwards toolkit is, right? So
Okay.
these are tools, and if you go through the book, there are prompts to use with AI, there are steps and processes to go through, specific styles of experiments, data discovery that will actually lead you through if you use these tools, and you can kind of pick and choose as you go and iterate to actually achieve product market fit, product launch, but it also goes into launching a business. So is this a viable product in economic terms as well? So why don't we really set the baseline here of what is the WBT? What is the Working Backwards Toolkit?
So I guess it starts with that number that I talked about before from Harvard Business Review, which is 85% of new products fail. And the question is why? Why is it that so much innovation, so many innovative products, why is it that they fail? And by the way, when we say fail, we mean it doesn't make product market fit. So it's a product that goes out to market and the market says, no thank you, and then that product essentially dies. And when you look at the underlying research, it turns out that it's not that hard conceptually. There's really only 4 reasons why a product won't find market fit. And the first one is that the customer doesn't exist. So the customer that we thought was out there that we were building a product for, they don't exist in the way that we thought. So that's one thing. So obviously when you launch that product to market, there isn't an actual customer in real life who wants to buy it. And then the second problem is that, yes, the customer exists. We have found a real customer, but we're wrong about what their problem is, right? We think the problem is one thing, but the problem is actually something else. And that comes back to the interesting thing about what you said about Henry Ford, which is if I ask my customers what they want faster horses. So sometimes what you think is the customer problem because you've talked to them, right? But you've maybe talked to them in the wrong ways so that you're hearing about what they think they need rather than what they actually need. Sometimes fun to just watch customers and watch how they actually move through a space rather than how they describe they think they would like to move through this space, right? Or, a typical one is, oh, I'm going to go to the gym every day this year, and then you watch what they actually do, and they don't go to the gym every year. So if you build the gym, that's maybe not the right solution for their real problem. So those were 2 things. One is customer doesn't exist. 2 is problem doesn't exist. The third issue is that the customer exists, we do understand their problem, but we build the wrong thing for them. Typically we build the wrong features, so that the product that we're selling doesn't actually solve the problem that they have. And the fourth issue is that, well, customer really exists, they really have the problem that we think they do, our solution is awesome, but we can't figure out a business model that will convert that opportunity into profit for the company. So we just can't figure out how to make money. So that's it. Those are the 4 problems. And if you look at the 85% failure rate of product market fit, they will all come down to one of these 4 problems.
You mentioned earlier that this material builds on a lot of previous research and some really good sources like Eric Ries with Lean Startup. Can you talk a little bit about what those contributors have brought to the table, and how you've leveraged some of that previous work in this, and also what some of the other methodologies are for addressing product market fit and ideation, and how those compare a little bit.
Yeah, so there's lots of theoretical frameworks and practical tool sets out there. So the one most commonly used is something called design thinking. And design thinking is also is quite similar to working backwards, but it focuses on different aspects of the whole process. And I want to get into the actual process of working backwards toolkit so I can properly compare them. But that's probably the most common is design thinking. However, for the Working Backwards Toolkit, the benefit of it is that we sort of had Lean Startup to talk about how do you run experiments and what's the benefit of the scientific method, which we're going to talk about heavily here. Then you have design thinking, which gives you a whole set of tools to understand your customer. You have, or your cat in this case, and then you have Lean Six Sigma, which allows you to really diagnose journeys and understand where problems exist in journeys. And then all of these kind of ultimately come from the Toyota production system, which brought all of these as ideas. It was still young, but it brought them all as ideas that were then iterated upon. But those are the, like, Lean Startup, Design Thinking, Lean Six Sigma, and TPS are probably the streams that run together to create Working Backwards Toolkit. And I should say Working Backwards, of course. That's the fifth one from Amazon, is the philosophy. Yeah, that comes into play. But I think all of them sort of come to this similar conclusions at the beginning about, there's these four things that happen in the marketplace that create product market misfit. And the reason for that is interesting. The reason is that we, as business people, we make very wrong assumptions about what we know. However, that process is very reasonable. Like, it makes sense if you've been successful at solving customer problems for your career, like the last 30 years, it makes sense to say, hey, that means I'm good at this, and my future ideas also are going to be successful because I've had this successful past. And the problem, of course, is that, well, the customers don't stay stagnant. They continually change. So Gen Z buyer is very different from a Gen X buyer. And so it doesn't matter if you've been successful selling to Gen X's. If we're going to start trying to sell to Gen Z's, or Gen Y's or whatever else, Gen Alpha, they're totally different, and they have different problems. They have different ways that they want to be sold to. They have different features that they need. And so just because you've been great in the past doesn't mean you'll continually be great in the future. And the problem is that we make those assumptions. And so every time we put out a new product, the reality of the market changes, the customer changes, the technologies are changing. And so that's why 85% of products fail, is because they're built on these faulty assumptions. And I cut you off. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say that's a common, logical fallacy that people fall prey to, is if they succeed, they don't necessarily know how or why, and they don't necessarily know what that implies for future success. So as with financial, advising, current success doesn't, promise future success. So you need those mechanisms to really apply scientifically to build success after success. But why don't we get a little bit deeper into what the actual working backward tools are? Because I think that's another difference from the other methodologies from my perspective, is, the book and the consulting program, and we'll dive into those separately, they both give you step-by-step ways to take your specific situation, your specific, hypothesis, and build that through iteration and experimentation into a business or a product. And I think that's what some of the other methodologies aren't as practical and proactive about. And that's where I think the interesting differentiation and value is for WBT. So why don't you tell us what, from first more of a consulting perspective, what does an implementation of a Working Backwards Toolkit program look like?
Well, that's a really big question. And I want to set it up just a little bit more, because there were a couple of things I wanted to mention about the toolkit itself before we talk about the implementation, because the implementation is a much bigger question. And what I wanted to say is that, when we have this problem which is that we're making assumptions. We need as you said, mechanisms in order to challenge us and to stop us from doing that. And in working backwards, that process is really evidence-driven product development. So we don't use assumptions, we don't use subject matter experts, we don't use anything but experiments to gather actual evidence from the field about what's happening. And in working backwards, we do that for there's three specific mechanisms. The first is customer validation. So this is a set of tools that are used to gather evidence to prove that the customer exists, right? The second set of mechanisms is called, and I should say with customer validation, customer exists and problem exists, right? And then the second set of mechanisms is solution validation. And there, again, it's a set of tools to gather evidence that the solution actually is going to solve, or, I know you hate delight, so maybe we'll call it la la boo boo.
Too close to Labubu, man. That's even worse.
Oh dear. So solution validation essentially makes sure that the customer is going to be super happy, I guess. And then the third set of validations are called business validations, which is we can actually make money doing that. And so you have customer validation, solution validation, and business validation, which are the fundamental mechanisms that allow us to confirm that the opportunity that we think we have is actually real. And what you'll find is 85% of the time, there was no actual opportunity. And these tools allow you to gather evidence to prove that that's true, so that you don't spend money building something which should never have been built. Now, these mechanisms, the three mechanisms, are built upon 12 tools. So there's 4 tools in each of them, and the 4 tools are actually there to implement the scientific method. And if you think back to primary school or elementary school, you would have been in a science class, and the science teacher definitely would have gone through the scientific method. And most people remember that the scientific method had something to do with coming up with a hypothesis and then experiment in a lab. And that's true, that is a fundamental part of the process, but actually it begins earlier. So how you get the hypothesis actually comes from just observation. So you've got a scientist and he's sitting in an apple orchard and he notices that the apples are falling, and interesting, no matter how big the apples are, they seem to fall at the same rate. So I'm going to come up with a hypothesis about why I think that what I'm seeing in nature, I want to come up with a hypothesis that explains that, or in this case a mathematical formula that's going to explain falling objects. And then you design an experiment to test whether the hypothesis validates or invalidates. So did the experiment show that my hypothesis explained the actual observation, yes or no? And in that process, whether you realize that the hypothesis was validated or invalidated has nothing to do with failure. It's just learning. I've learned that the math was correct or the math was incorrect, and it's not about failure, it's about learning. So if the math is incorrect, that means we need to go back to observation again and see what was wrong with our observation. What did we not see that was actually happening in nature that we couldn't describe? And then we describe that new thing, we experiment again, and it goes around and around in this loop until your experiment actually validates the hypothesis. And that would be so then we've learned something. We've actually learned that we could come up with an experiment or a hypothesis that really does predict the future.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, from there you then want to validate it, but have other scientists rerun your experiment to make sure that they get independent results, and then you actually want to come up with new, different experiments that test the same thing, but with different methodologies, so that you're testing it from as many angles as you can. And at the end of the day, the 4 tools underlying each of these 3 mechanisms are observation, hypothesis, experiment, and analysis. And so the 4 tools in each of those things that we're actually going to apply as innovators, all they are doing is they're just an implementation of the scientific method.
Right. And like you said, in the scientific method, there is no such thing as failure unless you just run a terrible experiment, which doesn't produce data. All data is successful information that is learned from and informs future iterations. I think I want to take a quick pause to talk about what you mean by tools, right? Because, we're not talking about wrenches and hammers, but we're also not just talking about ideas or steps. So the ways that these tools are implemented in the field or by customers, by different people, and startups or whatever. These tools are a combination of kind of specific steps, and it's integrated with AI as well to kind of drive all of these processes forward and build results, but also kind of an overall view of how this is going to work as a product in a business. So can you touch on that a little bit as well?
Yeah. So if we go in, let's say we go into customer validation, and remember, customer validation, we want to determine is our understanding of the customer correct, and do we understand their problem? And so there's 4 tools. The first one is called a persona, and a persona actually has. Oh, I've just lost you.
I'm still here.
Are we recording still?
Yes, we are. I've still got you.
Okay, I'll just start again, but I can't see you anymore. Okay, so a tool is basically an artifact plus a process to do something with its goal directed, right? And so if you think of your classic business school SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat, the artifact is your 2x2 grid with SWOT, and it's a process to complete each of these quadrants by bringing a team together to generate a wisdom of a crowd's answer to SWOT. And it's there to create strategy. So in working backwards, all of the tools are basically the same. It's an artifact plus a process of filling out the artifact and some kind of a goal. So for example, in customer validation, the first tool in the process, the observation tool from a scientific method perspective, is called the persona. And a persona is a 2x2 grid, as it turns out, and it has facts, goals, pains, and behaviors. And there's a process by which teams get together to put their empathy about customers into the tool, so that the tool will reflect everything that we think we know about a customer at any one point in time. And the goal, of course, is to create your observation, like the scientist sitting in the field. It represents what we think we know. From there, that information will go into the second tool, which is called a customer and problem hypothesis, and that goes through its own kind of cycle. The nice thing is, in today's world, AI is a fantastic co-creator with you, because when you're filling out any of these tools, you can actually get AI to create a first draft of the tool for you, which can save a huge amount of time. And so in the book, we've actually given prompts that can be used throughout all of the tools in the Working Backwards Toolkit to pre-populate with, reasonably good ideas, a baseline. And then from there, you iterate, well beyond what you would have put in the tool or what AI would have put in the tool. You use the iteration process, the experimentation process to iterate beyond that baseline.
Okay, great. So now maybe we can go through what the actual program looks like in terms of implementing. That's what you were getting to earlier. So.
Yeah. So most companies begin with something that we just call masterclass, but it's an actual 8-day classroom experience, or I should say it's an 8-day experience. 4 days are in the classroom and 4 days are in the field running experiments. And so we typically teach customer validation and solution validation in the first 2 days, and then participants will go out for the rest of the week, and they'll spend that time to run experiments and iterate through these tools. And then they come back, and then there's a second 2 days on business validation, and then again they go out and they practice the tools in practice, and it kind of ends with this, what we call a spark tank, which is like a Shark Tank but creating ideas instead of eating people.
And not copyrighted.
I don't think Shark Tank is copyrighted, dude.
Oh, it must be. It's the name of a TV show.
I know, but it existed as a term long before the TV show, though. So I don't think they could claim it. Anyways, we use Spark Tank, which is nicer anyways. And so typically enterprises will send maybe 50 to 100 participants through a masterclass to teach them the core skills of Working Backwards Toolkit. If you have 10 teams of 5, typically teams would be between 4 to 6. But let's say you have a team of 5, you have 10 teams of 5 go through masterclass. Typically, 2 or usually most 3 will actually use the tools correctly and actually discover a real business opportunity for that business. Those teams typically then go into a 12-week Idea Accelerator program. And the Idea Accelerator program is not teaching anymore. This is real implementation there's real budget because you're pulling aside 5 people to do something for 12 weeks. So this is a commitment to use the tools to really validate that this is an idea worth proper investment in. From there, it will go into a third stage, which is called venture build, where it can either be a spin out or a spin in, where you're actually going to take the idea from validated business plan to minimum lovable product. So that's sort of the phase. Now, underneath all of that is something called enzyme. And enzyme is a process by which you apply the tools of working backwards not to end products, but to internal processes that are stopping innovation from happening. So usually in a big enterprise, a good reason why innovators fail is because they get stuck in the weeds of corporate,
bullshit.
Yeah, bullshit. Yeah. And but that bullshit is hard to solve, and often the bullshit is there for good reasons, and it's not actually bad. It's just slows innovation down. And so what we do is we create enzyme teams which are going to go into the corporate infrastructure ahead of your innovating teams and start to take down all of the things that are preventing innovation from happening in that organization. So they're simply applying Working Backwards Toolkit to processes rather than to products. And so that enzyme team just works ahead of the innovators to start clearing barriers. Could be like, hey, it takes 6 months to procure a third-party software developer, and we need that in order to build our internal startup. So, and you can't wait 6 weeks or 6 months. So we're gonna address that policy and innovate around it. Then on top of everything is something called Innovation Engine, which is like orchestrating and controlling all of those pieces together into a whole to make sure that the enterprise is spending the right money on the right projects to get the highest return on investment possible.
Okay, so three questions on the back of that. One is who makes up the enzyme teams? And I'm assuming this is to catalyze innovation.
Yeah.
The second is, how do you get that kind of overarching view, and you need a senior stakeholder to kind of own that. And then the third, maybe this is too much to cover, but the third is, this is in an enterprise environment, so I'm interested in how this would work for a startup as well.
Yeah. So the first question, who are the participants of Enzyme? The first part is that we will require that any participant of Enzyme has been through masterclass. So they understand the Working Backwards tools already. They understand, they're committed to the process. They know what's going on. But generally speaking, you're going to start by doing a pulse check on the organization about innovation. Because organizations do know where their blockers are. So if you go out and gather that information through interviewing relevant stakeholders, you'll get a pretty darn good list of the top 10 things that need to be fixed. And then you spin up, let's say, in this case 10, but usually it's like 3. You'll spin up 3 enzyme groups that are focused on the 3 worst barriers to innovation. And then if it happens to be a compliance thing, your team is going to be legal, somebody from compliance, somebody from marketing, and maybe 3 innovation catalyzers or 3 folks on the ground who are going to apply the Working Backwards Toolkit. And then you hold them accountable at the end that they have to deliver this thing. And you've got everybody internally in the team necessary for that to happen. If software were to be required, you would have somebody from IT in there as well. But essentially these, we would say 2 pizza teams, meaning that it's between 8 to 10 people. They should have everybody they need to actually make change in the organization independently. Typically, these big innovation programs will be sponsored by the CEO or the head of the business. Right. So, they know that they have to deliver this thing. One thing I would say, by the way, that makes it easier in an enterprise context is that there's sort of 2 possible solutions. The first one is easier. It says, how can we change this process so that this innovation team can go quickly through it, right? And we're not solving it for the company, we're solving it for this innovation team. And that's an acceptable, that frees it up for what we need in the program. But really, the gold standard is, you say, keep the enzyme team together to think about how do we solve it as an organization once and for all. The other thing I think that's important to mention about enzyme is that we're not saying that any process is bullshit or is bad, right? Mostly, every process, compliance process or legal process or procurement process, they were all put in for good reasons. But most of them were designed in such a way that they were solving for one specific thing without understanding the implications for other processes in an organization. So they may have solved this procurement compliance check because the regulator told them to, but they didn't realize they were slowing innovation down in the way that they designed the process. What we find
also, I think one of the things that I've observed a lot in organizations of that scale is processes just bloat, and nobody ever goes and cleans out processes or optimizes them. You just build one on top of another, and they just, they keep growing. It's scope creep for process, so process creep.
And so this is a healthy process where you can go in and you say, listen, there's 15 different ways we could solve that original compliance problem. Some of them slow innovation down, some of them speed innovation up. Let's not be held hostage by the one process that we came up with originally. We actually have 10 different solutions. Let's explore all of them to see which one we can be compliant and innovative and remove bloat, process debt from the environment.
Yeah, did you just coin that? Process debt. I kind of like that.
I don't know. I definitely invented culture debt, I think. I don't know. I said it. I don't recall anyone saying it before. But yeah. For those who are listening, the original idea comes from tech debt, which is the technology bloat that happens in organizations that make it impossible to make any changes. And so we're riffing off that to say there are other forms of debt in an organization. Yeah.
So, and the second question was you discussed the overarching kind of enterprise-wide approach. And I wonder if you could give us an idea of what that looks like. How involved is the business leader in that and the stakeholders?
I think that, I'm thinking of, let's say, because there's several public case studies that are, they're public online. And one of them is Petronas, which is like a Shell or an Exxon. It's a huge oil and gas. In fact, it's probably like 50% of Malaysia's GDP. It's a massive oil and gas company. And they were a strong early adopter of the Working Backwards Toolkit. And I would say early on, there was a lot of leadership commitment. So, for example, all of the CEOs, one-downs, all took masterclass. They literally went into masterclass and took it. And you can imagine, like, you're some mid-level or low-level staff, right? And you go to this innovation training, and you sit at your table, and like your table, you're sitting with the CEO, right? And it's an important signal. That kind of folklore, that person goes back and tells people, and that spreads around the organization that this isn't just a training program. This is a serious change initiative that's happening, and leadership is taking it seriously. And all of those people then go out to the field and start changing the way they interact. They start thinking of their processes in the scientific method. They're asking different sorts of questions. They're saying, someone comes back and has an idea and they think it's a good idea. They don't just say, let's fund this. Or, they're going to say, okay, can you come back with evidence to demonstrate why this is actually a good idea? Did you talk to customers? Did you talk to partners or suppliers? Did you even talk to internal teams about the implementation of this? It starts to change the discussion, the dialogue, and employees begin to feel that it's a much more open and safe environment for them to bring ideas. They're not going to get hammered, or they're not going to get roses thrown at them or daggers thrown at them. They're going to be in a discussion about iteration.
So these are, sorry, I'm just going to butt in real quicker. So these are mechanisms to kind of continually drive innovation processes throughout the culture of an organization, and those continue after the program itself.
Absolutely. I wanted to say, the other thing I wanted to say about leadership is it gets less and less, because once the culture gets rolling and you get enough evangelists there, the leadership can step back. They still have to walk the walk, but they can put a little less commitment into their time. What you said about culture is really, really important, and it actually comes down to a fundamental idea at Amazon, which is that leaders don't drive culture, mechanisms drive culture. So if you design the culture that you want into the processes that humans are executing, they will start to embed that culture into themselves as part of just doing the process over and over and over again. The nice thing about humans is if you can make someone do things over and over and over again, they'll eventually their brain will fall in line to whatever that is. So
that's the nice thing and the terrible thing about humans.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
But
well, as a cult leader, I think it's pretty nice.
I mean, I think, this is, and we could go down a huge rabbit hole on Amazon and the leadership principles and how the various mechanisms are deployed within the organization to drive that culture, where that culture is now as opposed to where it was. It's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. But if you're not in an Amazon, if you're not in a Patronus, for example, so you're maybe one person with some AI agents, or you're a small team trying to run a startup. How does this look when you're kind of applying the Working Backwards Toolkit to, a startup?
Well, validation is probably even more important with fewer people because there's more chance of you getting anchored into your own crazy mental models that aren't actually true. So if you're just a single person or a three-man shop with a AI team behind you, then you still implement the exact same processes you would if you're in a 10,000 person organization. You just have to have the discipline to do it yourselves. But it's more important when you have no challenge points.
What does that mean?
Startup CEOs are pretty egotistical as a creature, and just like 85% of products fail to hit product market fit, we would say that 95% of a VC's portfolio will go bust as well. And it's for the same exact reasons as the startup CEO came up with an idea on a napkin when he was drunk or when she was drunk and thought this was the best idea in the world and just, it gets $10 million of investment and then flushes it down the toilet. That's because they didn't really validate customer problem, solution, and business model.
Back to that logical fallacy.
Yeah.
And so in some ways it's easier in a startup because you don't have to kind of overhaul a culture. You can build it from the ground up. You don't have to remove a lot of those institutional barriers. You can just kind of avoid creating them and think about how you do your organizational and process design to be more efficient and innovative.
I think what you said earlier, that good processes will all suffer from bloat in reality. And it's not that it's a bad process. So when you said we don't want to build them in the first place, yeah, you do. You want to build organizational infrastructure and processes.
I don't think I said you don't want to build processes. I love process.
This is recorded.
Think about how you do your organizational process design to be more efficient and innovative. I'll check back.
Your daughter is doing the editing, so I think you can do whatever you want, damn it.
I have control.
Yeah, I think we don't, but we do want to build them. We just want to have mechanisms in place that recognize that this is going to happen. Cultures, infrastructures, all of this stuff are going to decay over time, and you just want mechanisms to continually refresh. Too bad we don't have that in the States.
Yeah, let's not go there. The process thing is really interesting to me because it kind of ties in with mechanisms as well. But I'm an NBA fan, and one of the things in the NBA that's gotten hugely into analytics more recently, and there's a differentiation between outcome and process. So you want to maximize the probability of success within a process and build on that rather than determine, okay, well, this worked or it didn't work. That means the process worked or didn't work, right? So the process might be correct, and you want to refine and tweak that according to success or failure. But what you don't want to do is say, okay, well, I had a bad process, but I had success, so I'm just going to keep doubling down on that. Or I have a good process, and this didn't work this time, but so I'm going to throw out the process. What you want to do is say, okay, well, the process was correct, and this is in a lot of management books as well, which is, you take a risk, you want to build in the possibility of risk, and as long as you're doing it the right way, right? So innovation is always a risk. So that concept of, fail fast, fail often, all that stuff, which is a little bit misleading because it's more experiment, but whatever. But the idea is you want to take those risks, and there's a chance that it's not going to have a successful outcome, but you want to maximize the possibility of success by building better and better processes. Yay. Okay.
Working Backwards Toolkit idea.
Okay, so you mentioned Patronus. I wonder if you could really give some other on-the-ground examples of companies who have deployed this with your help, and how those worked similarly, differently, what some of the challenges and successes were from those.
Yeah, I think that fortunately, I haven't yet been in a program that failed. So I would say in all the cases, we have generated enough returns from the actual ventures created that you get a 10x return on their investment in running the program. So I would say, fortunately, 100% of the time that I've been involved, yeah, the companies have gotten enough in innovation-driven revenue that it paid 10x of what they paid to implement it. But there are definitely companies that got less of a bang for the buck. And
Sure.
So one thing that customers can do to sort of hamstring themselves is that they're not really committed to change. They're committed to the theater. They want to be seen as innovative.
Innovation theater.
Yeah, and they want good press. They want to brag about it in onboarding, how great our culture is, but they're not actually committed to a meaningful change. And what you get is you get a quick decay. You get the innovation engine, you have enzyme teams, you have accelerators, and that lasts for maybe 3 to 4 years, or sometimes it can be the cycle of a CEO. So in Malaysia, for example, the CEOs rotate throughout government-linked companies, and so you may only have a tenure of 3 years. Each CEO may only be there for 3 years, and then they move. And once the leader is gone, if you haven't established a self-sustaining program, then all your momentum is gone, because actually the whole thing was being sustained through the efforts of a person. And that once that person is gone, if you haven't established the scalable mechanisms, it'll die out. It will die out eventually. So I think that commitment is key, is that we're really here to drive change, and it's not to just look cool.
Right. And you talk about the success rate, and I think it's a little bit misleading. 100% success is based on you're trying, like you said, 3 to 5 ideas, right? So you're maximizing the blast radius of possibilities for success within that. So even if one of those succeeds, it can drive that 10x return for the entire program.
Just that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you look at companies like Patronus or PNB in Malaysia, another financial institution. These guys are running tens, hundreds, or thousands of ideas through the process. So their portfolio is quite large. And when they make, Patronus, several of the investments were sort of $100 million investments, and so the returns are in the billions. So, these are going to be, if you're big, you can swing big, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, you're just taking the same math that goes into venture capital and applying it internally, which is, okay, 90% of these ideas are going to fail, but the 10% or the 5% that remain are going to have outsized returns, 50x, 100x, whatever it is, that justify this. And this is a real different operating model for businesses looking to drive innovation within themselves, to act like VCs. And promote those ideas within the organization.
And by the way, what we have found is that the companies who have adopted this come to about 60%. They go from 90% failure rate to 60% failure rate. So they're still failing a lot, but they fail much less than they did before. And like you say, the returns are outsized on the opportunities that actually make it through.
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose of the toolkit, as you started out with, is to reduce that failure rate, right?
Yeah.
So the failure rate isn't the same as in the wild. The failure rate is going to be lower if you have all these processes and this experimentation and iteration.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious to hear about, you can make your point in a sec, but I'm really curious to hear about real stories from the trenches, what these customers did, what happened. I don't know how much of this is, you know, non-confidential information, but I'm really curious to hear about those.
Yeah, so what was I going to say? I was going to say that the thing about the failure rates, right, is that one, working backwards significantly reduces the failure rates of companies, but also they significantly reduce the cost of the failures, because working backwards is great at killing projects when we have enough evidence, rather than letting a company, continuing to invest in an opportunity that we already know is not going to fly.
Well, there's two things, right? So it's not just that. It's not just, nipping things off at the bud quickly if they're not validated, but it's also the cost of validation is less, because you're not looking to build a really large prototype of everything. You're looking to experiment as cheaply and quickly as possible.
Yeah. So we the cost of the cost of the early stages is much less, and the speed by which we can determine when we should be canceling a project is much faster. So I know within 8 weeks if the project should just simply be canceled, and I know from my experiences working in enterprise that an idea like that could get 3 years of investment before they finally just close it down, right?
Yeah.
But I could have told them in 8 weeks, the customer doesn't exist. Like, no point in building this business.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a company where we both worked, which maybe we should let remain unnamed, but there were tons of these 3 to 5 year initiatives with waterfall plans, and you would get 2 years in before you realized this was a huge mistake, and it's just costing tens of millions of dollars or even more, and it's just going to go straight into the toilet. It's just never going to do anything. And I think this is really about, it's a different way of working in a more agile organization in this modern context, and it's going to be required for companies to succeed, especially when we're talking about AI and innovation just becoming part of the DNA of more disruptive technology over and over again happening. And one thing, I'm going to bring this, I'm just going to put a pin in this now, and maybe we'll come back to it later, is I also think the Working Backwards Toolkit is a great and uniquely positioned methodology to drive and validate and find success with AI project implementation as well.
God, yes. Definitely. I'm going to pull that pin out and throw the grenade straight back at you. No, I mean, I can't even think of an AI project I've seen that actually went through deciding whether or not it was something that should be built in the first place, right? I mean, most AI projects today are, hey, let's use AI, let's come up with some AI solution, which is exactly not working backwards. The working backwards should be, let's find a problem worth solving, and then is AI a good way to solve that problem? That's the order that it should be in. And now it's like, we've got AI solution, let's find something to
Let's find a problem. Where's a problem?
Yeah,
We got to find one because we're investing in AI.
In fact, they don't even do that. They're just like, they don't even find the problem. They just say, "Hey,
let's do something.
We have this AI solution. Let's just
what can the solution do?
What can it do? Yeah, that's it. Yes, that is 85% trash heap thinking right there. So I loved your question, which was about, let's talk about war stories, and it makes me think, only because I know we're not supposed to go on too long for this session, is let's put a pin in that, and let's invite some folks from Siemens and Petronas or Changi Airports or whoever else, and let's bring them in and have them talk about their war stories. I would learn a lot more from that if you wouldn't mind.
A voice of the customer. Okay, well, you are changing the format of the podcast in real time, so we'll see how that works.
It's iteration.
Maybe just give one interesting case study, just the one paragraph version of something interesting that came out of it that was maybe a little surprising. And we can look at getting a guest on to speak more explicitly in more detail about that. What about just randomly Siemens? So what happened there? What was interesting?
I'm actually thinking of LG because that was more fun because that was a technology, a laser technology used for bald people. So
I'm not just
unfortunately,
I'm not just the CEO.
of Hair Club for Men.
I'm a customer.
But the problem is that you have to use it before you're bald. So I couldn't be a sample customer.
Yeah, I was going to say
unfortunately.
you're not looking like a successful example of that program.
But that's neither here nor that's not a war story. I just thought that was a funny. I remember seeing the because I live in Singapore and Orchard Road is like the Beverly Hills. It's like the shopping zone, and I remember seeing the product much later at this shopping mall called Tangs, and I remember
Oh, yeah.
I went in. I actually saw it. Like, wow, here's the product. That happens a lot also with some of my school projects because I teach Working Backwards Toolkit at National University of Singapore in Singapore and Thammasat University in Thailand, and I get to like all the time. I'm just out there and I see the students running their businesses, full on.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because this is not a theoretical concept. This is not hypothetical.
No.
This has been applied, has succeeded at different levels across very different types of organizations, as well as with your students, with startups and things like that.
We did this at Amazon, so it's been a while. It's been like 3 or 4 years since we've collected the data, but I remember at Amazon we had collected the data, and I think it was 600 million US dollars have been invested in Working Backwards Toolkit projects by Amazon or AWS customers, and I think it was 4 billion in returns so far just from the Working Backwards Toolkit spin-off projects. So, and that was a while ago. Now, I'm sure those numbers are much.
Yeah, and those are things that you've actually been driving. I want to point out for folks that might not be aware. I mean, you're basically a leader in this field, and you've been driving these programs for many years. So, what your experience and your understanding of this is not
Well, see,
fly by night.
Before I used to have hair, you see. So if I think the solution to bald headed is don't get on innovation programs.
Okay, so maybe we're ready to talk about kind of a little bit what's next, because you've been in and out of these organizations. So kind of what happens after the implementation of WBT, and has it? We discussed the mechanisms for kind of changing the culture and having innovation continue to drive product development in these organizations. But what are the mechanisms that you leave in place that help the business evolve, pivot, scale on innovation?
I think as a structure, the innovation engine is a really powerful set of mechanisms to scale and to sustain. There's a communications plan and path in place. There's project funding, and we didn't talk at all about changes to project funding, but there are big changes between waterfall project funding and agile project funding, which are put in place. So I would say all of those things. I think that the companies that have been most successful don't call it working backwards anymore. They have just integrated it into the way that they do business, and it's like it's the way they do business, and it's not a special identified thing. But you go in there and you ask, tell me about what evidence that you have, and that's not a strange question. It's like, oh yeah, here are the 5 evidences that I bring, and here's how we validated this. Here's the customer discovery interviews we've done there, and I think that's when it's very successful, when it's invisible.
Right. So I guess I wouldn't call it invisible at Amazon, but I would say it permeates the entire organization. So the mechanisms in Amazon, we've discussed some of them: PR, FAQ, 6-pagers, but also the entire hiring process is built around the leadership principles, and it's about maintaining that culture of innovation and experimentation. So are those kind of other mechanisms that are integrated?
Those would be I think in Working Backwards, the 3 mechanisms are customer validation, solution validation, business validation, and there's a set of tools. And those you will still see.
But the innovation engine that you talked about.
Yeah, the innovation engine, and you'll have master classes, and you'll have accelerators, you'll have enzymes. All those
Okay. Those continue.
exist. Those continue. Yeah,
Okay.
but we don't. Yeah, it's like at Amazon. It permeates everything. It's not like you feel. It's not like you feel you're being controlled or that it's managed. It's the way that we work. And if
Right.
you
It's
can get
not
that,
it's
you'll
not
win.
kind of clunky and top down. It permeates. It's integrated. So,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I think we're getting ready to wrap up here. So what are, I mean, so from my perspective, I have some takeaways, but I'd like to hear from you as well, which is really, have processes that encourage innovation, use the scientific method, apply it, look at experimentation, iteration, quick pivots, cheap, fast ideation and testing of ideas, and this can be applied pretty broadly. I do think, and maybe you can get into this as a follow up, the actual tools in the book and in the consulting program help you do this, and it helps apply it more broadly across an organization or more deeply as well. So the broader ideas are really useful to kind of integrate into your thinking and your approach to problem solving. But I think maybe you can get into how the tools solving customer pain points, products, services that can drive sustainable business models, how people can avail themselves of these through the book and the program as well.
Yeah, I think certainly great if people out there buy the book, but if
Hey, raise up the book again. Let's see it.
yay, pay me money, yay. No, but I think that buying the book is great. Getting involved in a masterclass yourself, whether that's something that we do online. Dave and I are helping other companies roll this stuff out. So there are, if you're interested, I would just say if you're interested, reach out. And if you're not a big enterprise, if you're just interested in the stuff, there's only 2 Eric Tachibanas on LinkedIn, so I'm like really easy to find, and I'm a complete slut on LinkedIn. I'll accept any takers. So like, please just reach out and let me know if you have questions. I'm always happy to help on this stuff. It's all very, very interesting. And then we've got a bunch of projects around this stuff coming up. I want to put out the second book, which is not on the toolkit, but on the processes and mechanisms that Dave was talking about. How do you run an innovation engine? How do you run a masterclass? So that's the second book. And then I think in the far distance, I want to talk about the innovations that we're doing now, which is like applying working backwards, not to product innovation, but to sales and marketing, and to thinking about the growth cycle before, like after you've launched the successful, after you use working backwards to launch a successful product, how do you then scale it at startup speeds? We can apply Working Backwards Toolkit not to a product, but to a marketing strategy. If you think of a marketing strategy or a sales play as a product, and the customer is the customer, you can apply exactly the same toolkit to driving those things. So I'm really keen on sort of what's the future of expanding. Kind of coming back to your very original question is like, how can we apply this to things that are not nerdy business stuff that a normal person would be interested in listening to a podcast about?
Yeah, and I also, the AI stuff is really exciting because I think this is exactly what this phase of AI implementation is missing, which is, figuring out what the hell are we doing? What are we trying to do? And AI is really powerful, but it's so unfocused in the way people are using it. And it even extends to areas such as, organizational design because of AI, but just in general is evolving really quickly too. And so applying these principles and really ingraining them into the way that you do business, I think is going to be valuable as you become more agile, more adaptive, more responsive to customer needs, more responsive to data and information to make just better decisions in general. And I think it's a very powerful mental model and set of tools that can help with that. So I think that's just about it. I think we've covered a lot here.
Yeah,
So
hopefully it wasn't over an hour. I know we're trying to get these things to be a little bit more
we'll
consumable.
we'll try to get them a little shorter. We'll do some serious editing on this as well. But everyone, please give. We're easy to get in touch with, like Eric said. Leave a comment, share, subscribe. Feedback is a gift, so give us positive, negative feedback. Negative 1-to-1 maybe, less publicly. But yeah, hope you're enjoying this, and do come back. We're gonna have a different kind of topic next time, but we're gonna continue this conversation. It's of interest to both of us, and we're gonna build on this and keep moving forward. So, thanks for watching, listening, and talk to you soon.
Later.